proportion, and that is something that I think the Majid and Karima Shakir family really tells us a story. The life for this family before sanctions was one of relative ease. And slowly, after the sanctions were imposed and they started to feel the hold of this policy, and they eventually got to the point where they knew they could no longer live in this big home and keep it up and be able to maintain it. And so they sold the home and moved down the street to where I met them, which was a home that had a dirt floor in the kitchen with water stains of where the water rises in the winter, and it had sewage coming in the front door off this squalor in the street. And from this very same water source, a small garden hose was the water feed for the family. So we would shower with bowls of water dumped over our head with this same water. And sometimes the family was having to drink this water and cook with it. At times, Majid could bring water home from the factory that was 1 grade better. So there are only certain times during the day they could get water. This is what the situation has been since the Gulf War, because these power plants have not been rebuilt, because the supplies to rebuild basic infrastructure like water sanitation and electrical power in Iraq are often prevented from entering the country. We feel that we are responsible to change this.
Because of the time spent in Jumhuriya and in Basra, I have a very keen awareness of what's killing the Iraqi children. And when we toured the hospitals, the doctors repeatedly said that gastroenteritis was the #1 killer of Iraqi children, and other waterborne diseases, or diseases caused by drinking contaminated water.
Voices in the Wilderness people who had returned from Iraq wanted so badly to communicate the possibility to the U.S. public, and very particularly to U.S. mission, to the UN workers, that there was an option to break ranks, that it was a responsibility, that we undertook a number of lengthy fasts. We would cook lentils and rice and have contaminated water from the East River, and we would go to the U.S. mission, to the UN, with our meal and say, we'll break fast with you if you'll please just come down and talk to us and hear about our experiences being with people who never eat anything other than lentils and rice. And those fasts were very formative for our own group, because any time that we fasted, we always knew we could and we would go back to having our comforts, our security, our predicted and presumed ease of life. And it was as though people in Iraq were trapped inside of one huge prison.
My last fast was 40 days. August 2001, in front of the United Nations and across the U.S. mission to the UN, protesting the economic sanctions against Iraq. These sanctions have caused the lives of over 500,000 children. We visited homes and hospitals. We've gotten to know some families. I lived there for 7 weeks during the summer of 2000 in the poorest part of Basra and southern Iraq. These people in Basra have every reason to be severely depressed, but they've got these gleaming kids who are racing down the street with 2 plastics as their kites or their toys. I see them do that, and I realize that kind of hope can't be abandoned. And I'm not going to give up to despair.
City on September 11th, and we completed our fast in silence. None of us could find words to speak. And then finally, my friend Ramzi Kaisias said, we have to try to become now voices for peace for those who would become victims of a new war. But it was really very edifying to realize that actually the people who found their voices were extraordinary people who'd lost their loved ones on September 11th. And in a space, a deep spiritual space, found the words to say, our grief is not a cry for war.
You know what we're going to do now? 12 of us at least are going to walk from Washington, D.C. to New York City under the banner, our grief is not a cry for war. Did you hear the statements that some people made after September 11th attack saying, please don't retaliate. Please don't kill civilians in the name of my loved one who died. They were very eloquent. Our son would never have wanted violent retaliation. So we're going to carry these words. We want to pay reverence to these words. Walking to end war, hunger, and revenge. Then we'll have smaller walks that'll be joined by big numbers of people, each of the named cities along that route. And from there, I'll take off to Baghdad.
Nice. Tell us why you decided to join in this march.
Well, I really felt like I needed to do something to get our voice out, our family's voice out. A lot of people just assume that the families of victims want vengeance.
It's so ironic because some of the people who could best understand what people experienced in Manhattan on 9/11 are people who are targeted civilians elsewhere. One thing that many Americans can't understand is that on September 12th, there was so much of an effort to help rebuild, to help people overcome this terrible tragedy. Condolences came from all over the world. In Iraq, 5,000 of their children die every month. There hasn't been any condolence, just more and more punishment heaped on these people. And yet, when I go over there, and I don't even have to say why I'm there, people just spontaneously say in their own language, you are welcome. Sit down and have tea. We're always treated with dignity and hospitality and forgiveness. That has been my constant experience.
So I'm sorry for your loss.
Because you are the times welcome.
You come all this way to see another person who's had the same thing happen to her. Something came out of the sky and killed her child. I don't think my daughter died the same way. In some sense, she knew what was going to happen. She was on Flight 93. I don't think they knew what hit them. That's a little different. But it's still the same pain afterwards.
The Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons. The regime has long-standing and continuing ties to terrorist organizations, and there are al-Qaeda terrorists inside Iraq. The danger to our country is growing.
When I went over to Iraq, I stayed through the holiday season in a hospital, meeting with the same families every day, got to know some of the families quite well, especially just really fell in love with a little child named Muntadar. His name means waiting for. And Muntadar had a splenectomy the first day that I met him, and he was in a world of pain. There wasn't any question of giving him a little plastic harmonica like the ones we were distributing to everybody else that was on that ward. I felt very pleased when I went one day, and his mother told me that he had asked for me again and again, saying, "Wayne Cathy, Wayne Cathy." And when I came into his room, he had given me a little kiss on the cheek, and then he embraced his mother, and he asked her, "Does she have a harmonica for me?" And I pulled that out and gave it to him, and he just clutched it. He was beaming. Well, the next day that I went, January 5th, 2002, Muntadar's bed covers were turned back, and he had died that day. But that night I had gone to the Iraqi Symphony Orchestra's rehearsal. When the lights went down, I took that time to mourn for a little boy who, loved music so much with his plastic harmonica. Who knows, he might have been part of somebody's symphony someday. And when you let the floodgates open for mourning all of the 500,000 children under age 5, it's an overwhelming, almost an oceanic grief. I said, I think I need to be with some kids who maybe aren't so sick or troubled. And they worked it out for me that I could go to the Baghdad School of Folk Music and Ballet. And I was very, very happy to be there. And one of the children had created a drawing of the two twin towers and a passenger jumbo jet flying into the left-hand tower. I wanted to meet him. And so I asked him, could you tell me what was on your mind when you drew that? And he kind of squared his shoulders and he said, Allah wanted this to happen to people in America, so people in America know what happened to other people when America hit them. And then he saw his teacher come, and he looked at me and he said, and we love the people in America, and we want to be their friends. Oh, goodbye heart. He was a very charming child. So I started to tell him and his other friends about being in New York on September 11th, and they were very concerned. And I wanted them to know that 150 families in the New York City area, as they planned the memorials for their loved ones, had chosen a particular song. And it's a song that celebrates the common humanity between people. It was written after World War I by people who hoped there would never be a World War II. And within 2 days, those children, with violin accompaniment, were singing this particular song to me in Arabic. One of the best days of my life. This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my dreams, my hopes,
country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating.
occupation first arrived outside our hotel were a large unit of Marines. And it was a very tense moment. You know, they were lining up outside the hotel and beginning to come up out of their hatches. And actually, when we saw them with their helmets and very excruciatingly young faces, they looked pretty harmless, really. At that point, with the Marines down there looking tired and hungry and thirsty, I turned to Cynthia, and you know, there was a wall of bottled water that we'd stored up, thinking we would need it. I said, they look pretty thirsty, don't they? And Cynthia, who is 73 years old, headed out to go and bring water to the soldiers. I followed after her. I remembered that Iraqis always would serve us dates, Iraqi dates with water, so I had a box of dates. Just what Cynthia would do. She simply won't be governed by borders or distinctions that might take precedence over her belief that we're all part of one another. Just days before the shock and awe campaign began, we had fasted and vigiled down at the border, a place called Safwan, between Kuwait and Iraq. And on the Iraq side of the border, we had bought a huge banner that said, "Courage for peace, not for war." And we had enlarged vinyl pictures of children, families, friends. And we carried those right up to the border. And then when we went back to the Al-Fanar Hotel in Baghdad, we hung those banners from our balcony so that all through the war, the shock and awe, and at the beginning of the invasion into Baghdad, the first thing that the newly arriving troops would have seen would have been those big banners and those pictures of some of the most gorgeous children you could ever see. And our friend Neville held a sign